Recording. So welcome everyone. Um, just want to take a moment to start us off with a little bit of a centering exercise before we get started. So if you're seated, if you want to sit firmly in your seat with a straight spine. If you're standing, you can stand straight and make sure that your feet are planted underneath you. So let's take a moment to breathe and be breathed together and center ourselves in whatever space we find ourselves in today, and to get out of our heads, where so many of us are probably spending most of our time these days surfing our screens and downloading information on the world. So if you feel comfortable, you can close your eyes or you can take a soft downward gaze. So just bring your attention to your breath. Just notice your breath, the quality of your breath, whether it feels strained, easily flowing, shallow or deep. Just notice. Then bring your attention to your inhale, noticing the cool air as it comes in through your nostrils. And exhale, noticing the warm air of your exhale. Just breathe like this, just noticing the temperature of your breath as it moves in and out of your nose. And then relax your shoulders, relax your face, relax your jaw. And allow yourself to smile externally and internally. Oh, if you have your eyes closed, you can slowly open your eyes. I'm just going to take a moment. I think most folks that are in this space probably have been in this space before, but we are recording this session today. So I want to make sure if anybody sees the recording that they understand a little bit about what we're trying to do in this space. So there's the Presbyterian Hunger Program has an initiative that we are calling the Global Solidarity Collective. So this is a collective that unites Presbyterians in the US with global partners to do the big work of decolonizing the economy, resisting exploitative systems, supporting Indigenous rights, and promoting just, sustainable ways of living in harmony with all of creation. So this specific space we call Solidarity Hour. And this is where we learn to support one another, take action to undo the harms of the doctrine of discovery, while embracing Indigenous wisdom and advocating for just policies that protect people on the planet. So today we have a special guest. We have the Reverend Andrew Black. Let me pin you here to join me. So Reverend Andrew Black is the associate pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Santa Fe, New Mexico. He's the founder of EarthKeepers 360, which is a movement focused on equipping spiritual leaders with tools needed to effectively engage modern environmental issues. And he's a member of the Caja del Rio Coalition, a diverse group of individuals, organizations, elected leaders, Pueblo leaders, spiritual leaders, conservationists, outdoor recreation enthusiasts, and more, who all share one thing in common: a commitment to preserving the beauty, history, water, and wildlife of Caja del Rio. So, thank you. We're so happy to have you join us today, Reverend Black, and we will let you take it away.
All right. Well, good morning. It's an honor and a pleasure to be with everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and see if this works for everybody. Make sure that this is okay. Get rid of that. All right. Let's do this. All right. Can everybody see that? Is that okay? Okay, excellent. So, as mentioned, I formed EarthKeepers really in 2016, and this came as a result of I led a trip of 40 different multi-faith leaders. You had everybody from rabbis to nuns to Presbyterian ministers and Methodists and UCC to you name it, and tribal leaders as well, to Bears Ears National Monument. And obviously we were working with tribal leaders and spiritual leaders at Bears Ears. Obviously there's the Intertribal Coalition that's kind of formed between the different tribes at Bears Ears, and we worked very closely with them to try to protect Bears Ears as a national monument. And it was out of that trip really that I formed EarthKeepers 360, which is a movement. It's a movement equipping spiritual leaders and congregations and communities with the tools needed to effectively engage on modern environmental issues. Some of you may already know this, but I'm also the public lands field director for the National Wildlife Federation. So I'm kind of a multi-hat wearing tent maker in some ways. I serve as an associate pastor at First Presbyterian Church, but EarthKeepers 360 was really my Lenten discipline. I got up every morning at 5 in the morning to work on building this out. My wife's a web designer, so she created all the graphics and things that you'll see. But I created all the content and working with other ministers and leaders across the country, and realizing there's a lot of people asking me for help and want to get involved and want to make a difference, just don't know where to go for resources and don't know how to be effective. And are very busy, especially faith leaders are very busy, as you all know. And so it was kind of out of that I created EarthKeepers 360, and we worked with about 350 different faith leaders and congregations across the country right now. And in the last year, we've worked on a wide variety of issues, everything from working with a chaplain in Georgia to protect the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, to a Presbyterian congregation in Dunedin, Florida, to protect sensitive coastline areas in the Tampa Bay. Worked with the San Carlos Apache here in Arizona. So I'm in Arizona right now. I live in Santa Fe, New Mexico, obviously full time, but I'm in Arizona right now. Work with the San Carlos Apache to protect Oak Flat, which is a really important sacred landscape for them and their ancestral homelands from mining threats, as well as working with various Pueblos to protect Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. I've done everything from working on wildlife corridors and connectivity, and how wildlife move across the landscape and the ability to kind of ensure that they can be healthy, to also working in the way water flows across the desert Southwest, which is obviously a really critical issue in many places across this country. And so, of course, want to encourage you all to check out our website. We have a weekly reflection. Sign up for that weekly reflection. It's got great quotes, and every week we have the hope is that we deepen and help people understand the history of spirituality and conservation in this country. We lift up lots of different people's voices in that as a quote for reflection. Some Sunday schools and creation care teams use this every week, but also have opportunities to take action, also have opportunities to get engaged in policy, and obviously attend events and things like that across the country. So want to encourage you all to sign up for those weekly reflections, check out the website, and it's a great opportunity for you to kind of get plugged into more things like this. And obviously, as I was mentioning to some of the folks here, an opportunity to promote different events that they're doing as well. So my whole hope is to be additive and collaborative, and to bring in lots of different ways to connect people in this sometimes compartmentalized, divided world. So with that said, want to talk a little bit about the Caja del Rio and how I got involved with it. In 2015, I actually wrote the case study and presented the case study on the Caja del Rio, which is located just south of Santa Fe, New Mexico, the capital, the oldest capital in the United States. And it's 106,883 acre of U.S. Forest Service and BLM lands. And I was asked to write the case study for the Obama White House. And so we presented this to the Obama White House and kind of talked about why the area is important and what are the values and cultural, historical, archaeological, ecological values, and what makes this area significant and worthy of national protection. Obviously, the Obama White House had it kind of teed up, thinking they were going to hand it off to the Clinton White House, and obviously that didn't happen, and the country changed very drastically. And so, we worked through the Biden administration on kind of those same things, on working towards protection, and literally had it at the 1-inch line of the goal line at the end of the Biden administration, and just didn't get it done, like a lot of other places, sadly. And we're obviously seeing some of the effects and the counter effects of that right now in this administration, but we'll certainly talk more about that. So let's talk about the Caja del Rio. Since time immemorial, the Caja has been a place of great journey. What originally were wild game migration paths ultimately became Pueblo footpaths. Thousands of years later, one of these Pueblo footpaths became the famed El Camino Real de Tierra Adentro, which was the longest Spanish trade route that ran from Mexico City kind of into north central New Mexico at the Pueblo of Oquehawinge. Centuries later, this trade route actually became designated as New Mexico Highway 1. It was part of our vie for statehood, showing Eastern folks that we too could do engineering in the West, and created a highway up in La Bajada Hill, which was a massive 700-foot rock face escarpment, kind of like you see actually in these pictures, but we'll show most pictures of that later. New Mexico Highway 1, actually, in the heart of the Great Depression, became Route 66. And so you had westward expansion as the country sought hope and moving west during the Great Depression. And obviously, John Steinbeck wrote about some of the portions of Route 66, especially those crossing the Caja del Rio in New Mexico. And so this area has been incredibly important as a sacred landscape and protection area for tribes, for the Spanish colonialists that came in later, and then of course for Anglo-Americans and westward expansion kind of through the 1800s and into the 1900s, and obviously today. It really is the gateway to the city of Santa Fe. That's the oldest capital city in the United States. And vice versa, the Caja acts as gateway in both directions. You can see in that picture the far distant mountains are Albuquerque. And so that's kind of get your bearing straight to give you a little bit better perspective. Here's kind of a map of the area to kind of put it into perspective in terms of what the area is. This is the checkerboarded area. You see the area in green is all Forest Service, U.S. Forest Service. The area in yellow is BLM lands. You can see that it's surrounded by an incredible amount of development on all sides, right? So that's one of the big threats to the area is you have an airport, you have golf courses, you have city encroachment kind of coming into this area. And then you also have Los Alamos National Labs and kind of the challenges of kind of the nuclear weapons industry up to that kind of north section of it. And then you have various pueblos kind of in all directions. And so what's really interesting is the Caja is also a really important linchpin. And what I mean by that is it's a linchpin of culture in the sense that, within the different pueblos, you see Cochiti Pueblo down there to the south, you see Tezuque Pueblo, there's San Ildefonso and other pueblos, Jemez Pueblo to the north and kind of to the north and the east. And what's interesting is all of those pueblos speak different languages. So you have Towa, Tewa, Tiwa, and they speak different languages. And the Caja is kind of the linchpin between that, right? Literally between all of those things are different languages of those different pueblos, kind of showing how this area is so critically important, kind of uniting those areas literally linguistically and geographically. The other thing that's obviously really interesting is it's an important wildlife corridor. So if you think about where this area is situated, you also notice there's various mountains in that area. Some of you have been to Bandelier, some of you have kind of been to Santa Fe and seen the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. It lies within 5 mountain chains. And so what's really interesting from your all's perspective, and especially with regard to like climate change, is when bigger fires break out in the Mountain West, as we have seen historically, and not only in New Mexico, but all over the West, especially lately, a lot of the animals move down into this area for refuge from climate caused fires and devastation. And so this area is really important to wildlife migration. It's a really important wildlife corridor where animals are kind of moving into lowlands and areas that are more riparian by these rivers, and obviously into areas by where they can then go back up into the mountains. So it kind of serves as a really critical wildlife corridor and connectivity area for multiple animals to move between these bigger landscapes. And this area is kind of part of what they call the Rio Grande Wildlife Corridor that literally runs all the way from Mexico up into Canada, up in towards Canada and certainly through Colorado and kind of those bigger states. just to give a little bit of history of this work, what was really cool is in the 90s, there were kids that were, working from different communities and villages in the area, and they started doing archaeological surveys of the petroglyphs in the area, and they found that there were already in the La Cienega area, we'll talk more about, there were 4,400 petroglyphs in less than a mile. It's one of the most densely populated petroglyph sites in the entire country, and petroglyph, as you all know, is rock art. And so these kids started working with the BLM to actually do those formal surveys in the 1990s and kind of make this part of their culture and heritage and understanding. Obviously, the Camino Real is designated as a historic trail. This coalition kind of formed in the early 2000s, and kind of worked on presenting this to, as I mentioned, the Obama White House. And our coalition is very diverse. We've got everything from Native American leaders and spiritual leaders and tribal leaders to tribal council members as part of this, as well as legal authorities from tribes, sovereign nations, and then we also have Hispanic land grant heirs and Acequia members and cattle permittees and hunters and anglers and hardcore environmentalists. And there was a reason that they asked me as a spiritual leader to do this work. Because how do you get all these people to get along and to kind of keep common ground and common vision in the face of the attacks and the challenges to this landscape? In my background, some of you may know this, is I also studied in South Africa with Desmond Tutu and on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And so I went over there on a fellowship to study truth and reconciliation and what that process has to offer the United States in terms of poverty, race, and HIV and AIDS issues. And so a lot of my background is along those lines. And so I was asked by some folks to help lead this coalition because you have not only incredible diversity in terms of culture and history and geography, but even among the tribes, there's incredible diversity. But of course, the challenge is there's also really complicated history, right? There's a history of colonialism, there's a history of violence and war, there's a history of oppression and injustice. And, the past is not the past, it's not even dead, right? It still lives with you in the room, and how you work through those things and how you protect an amazing landscape like this is really critical. And the Caja del Rio is where a lot of that history came to life and a lot of that intersectionality came to life. And so all the things that make the Caja so worthy of protection in terms of the identity of the United States and what this area is about, also make it really hard to protect because everybody has a very strong claim to it and very important claim to it historically. So how do you get everybody to work together in a common direction? And that's probably a big part of the reason they chose somebody with a spiritual leadership and background to try to get everybody to come together. So that's a little bit of how I got involved in the work. Here you see that, the incredible kind of riparian area. This is the Rio Grande kind of. So if you think about Caja del Rio, means box of the river. But really there's two rivers, right? There's the Santa Fe River and there's the Rio Grande, and it kind of, is on both sides of it. And so these form these huge canyons, and it's just a really unique area with the incredible volcanic life to it. There's some of the petroglyphs and some of the volcanism you see. The area's geology is studied literally from people all over the world. And it has just incredible, unique cacti forests. There you see some of that, just beautiful riparian areas down in kind of that lower right picture that are kind of fields and historic valleys. Just incredible wildflowers that come alive, and when the desert rains come in and the monsoons come in, really becomes lush and green landscape. And there you just see some of that different, riparian areas in the canyon. That's the Santa Fe River Canyon that you're seeing there on the right. And then obviously you have, yucca and just incredible amounts of cactus kind of forest. And these are very unique ecological areas, right? There's certain birds and certain reptiles and amphibians that only live in certain areas like this that and makes for a really unique desert habitat. But also, in that really Isaiah sense about seeing, kind of seeing spring hope and life kind of coming from that water, right? And that sense of, renewal coming out of the land. And it's a desert spirituality, right? It's very subtle, but it's also hidden, kind of in plain sight. It's beautiful and it's profound and it's deep. And it's a very deep place of prayer and pilgrimage as well. So we're going to have the story of the Caja del Rio through a little bit of the petroglyphs, is let them tell the story. As I mentioned, the La Cienega petroglyph site is a BLM site. It has over 4,400 petroglyphs in less than a mile. About a third of those petroglyphs are flute players. Some people call them cocopelis, as well as birds. And we'll talk about the significance of those petroglyphs. I really like this quote from Regina Whiteskunk, who spoke about this at the National Congress of American Indians. We don't have our histories in books, they're written on the walls of our canyons. So when people deface petroglyphs or still petroglyphs or shoot at petroglyphs or paintball petroglyphs or graffiti or etch on petroglyphs, they're essentially ripping out pages of a history book that can never be replaced. And petroglyphs are often the most complete telling of the stories, and petroglyphs that are, could be 100 yards away from each other, maybe, different pages of that book. And so when those are removed or harmed, you're basically shifting that understanding of the cosmology, the sociology, the history, the wildlife, the ecology that has been told. And not anybody can just do a petroglyph. It was done by very specific kind of chosen spiritual leaders, and for a very specific reason. If you think about how long, I mean, these petroglyphs are hundreds, if not thousands of years old, and how deep they had to be carved into those rocks and how methodically they had to have been carved into those rocks, to be still here today, right? And these are, harsh conditions with lots of wind and rain and snow and those kind of things, and yet here they are. And so the petroglyphs tell a very deep and complicated story of kind of what's going on culturally, historically, sociologically, spiritually, cosmology, kind of origin stories are all captured in these things. And that's why they're so important to preserve, because why I say they're the most complete telling is, you may pick up some of these same themes in pottery, or you may pick up some of these same themes in kivas or paintings. Petroglyphs tend to be one of the largest canvases, right, where you can have a more expanded telling or a more complicated or complex telling of that full story. And that's why they're so important to protect and preserve, because they also capture lots of the different kind of cultural and historical aspects of that were going on in the time. And they also may speak of climate events and other things that can teach us much about today, or they may speak of species that were on the landscape that are no longer on the landscape, right? And kind of talking about the different areas. So, people have been on this area for literally from 6,000 to 8,000 years at minimum. Hunters were following big game across this area. They made tools and weapons of basalt, basically using bow and arrows starting in the 400s to 700s. There was strong agricultural cultivation and farming going on, incredibly sophisticated systems of water catchment that were being used. And really, in around 900 AD, congregating into kivas and houses on this area. There was a copper mine actually in the 1300s in the Santa Fe River Canyon, one of the oldest mines that they've kind of found. And you can kind of see, the prevalence of people and the intersection of wildlife there. You see a snake, obviously, handprints, that are kind of speaking to all of these different things. You see a bow and arrow hunter there, a spear, a bird. And these are all pictures, of course, that I took or myself. Another member of the coalition took, Garrett Benaclawson. You see corn, petroglyphs, and kind of speaking to the agricultural area of this. And if you think about it, it's really interesting because they were growing corn on a hot, dry desert mesa, volcanic desert mesa, and they were able to capture water in incredibly sophisticated ways and move water in incredibly sophisticated ways, and also understand growing season in very different ways to have corn grow earlier and, planting at this time of the year, if not earlier, and have harvesting earlier, and then moving into riparian areas where there's more water. But what does that mean for the desert Southwest and for climate change nowadays? What did people understand back then that we need to understand now in terms of how to have food security and how cultures can understand their climate, and not just live in kind of more artificial ways? Obviously, you can see some of kind of the vistas and volcanoes that are in the area, the volcanic cones, the tias, that are formed there. You obviously have, cocopellis or flute players that are speaking kind of to the spring winds coming in, the seed pack, the hump on the back, the flute. And you all can research that. Those are very complicated symbols. They're multivalent symbols, right? You cannot look at a petroglyph and say it's simply one thing or the other, that these symbols are much more complicated, speaking to kind of cosmology, spirituality, growing seasons, all kinds of things, all at one time, right? So I think it's important to kind of see that too. You see a little bit of the spirituality here. There's an interconnection between the petroglyphs that are, for example, found in Bandelier, like the one antler up, one antler down that you see in the middle there, to ones that are found there. And you also see, complicated mask, or some would say kachinas, on these rocks that kind of speak to some of the clan markings or some of the kind of the spirituality of the people in the area. The other thing that you have is a remarkable amount of wildlife. So the area is known to be an important bird area, is how it's defined by the Audubon. That's a specific designation, and that's because there's songbirds, desert songbirds, that only live in this area that are can only be found much farther south and at much lower elevations. So it's kind of a unique hub of ecology. But you also have bigger raptors like this hawk right here. You know, you see a thunderbird petroglyph right there. You have burrowing owls, you have golden eagles and bald eagles. You have these incredible desert songbirds that are also important for, you know, kind of they're not only their uniqueness, but kind of keeping the overall habitat going. Pollinators, all connected to that as well. You have everything from, you know, certain Scott's orioles and Ben Dyer's thrashers to cactus wrens and all kinds of animals that live very specifically, especially birds in this area. And there's a reason that 1/3 of the petroglyphs are birds, right? That it kind of speaks to the uniqueness of this area and the incredible amount of biodiversity in the Caja del Rio. You've got roadrunners in there. One of the biggest roadrunners I've ever actually seen is on the Caja del Rio. I thought it was a small turkey. It was huge. And you of course see petroglyphs depicting all these different animals. You also got everything from bigger reptiles, you know, huge rattlesnakes in this area. Snakes are a very complicated symbol. One of my best friends, Brophy Toledo, is a spiritual leader and medicine man at Hemis Pueblo. He talks about snakes in a very different way than we often think about these in the West. The snakes obviously shedding their skin, you know, a sense of transformation, the ability to remove their scales from their eyes to see differently. They're not given the value judgments that we tend to put on them in a kind of a very modern, you know, Judeo-Christian mindset. They're given much more complex nuance, right? Where they go inward and they go outward, right? They live in holes and they come out. They also are kind of seen as the ups and downs of life, right? You can kind of see that in that petroglyph, so that there's this kind of natural flow to life, that they're kind of messengers of that. And so they're seen in much more complicated and nuanced ways, and I think actually in more helpful ways, in that sense of kind of transformation, in the sense of ups and downs and rhythms of life, and in the sense of kind of sometimes we need to go inwardly and sometimes we need to go outwardly. And so they're kind of seen in much more complicated spiritual terms. Here you see some of those bigger depictions of those rattlesnakes in the area. And then, of course, you see some of the vandalism that's happening on the petroglyphs, the etching, the defacement, right, that we're also talking about, the bigger threats. You have amazing eastern colored lizards. These are some of my favorites. So just think of like a little mini velociraptor. They run on their hind legs up to 20 miles an hour. They're very fierce. They're kind of fearless too. I mean, you can get right up and take a picture. They don't back down. They don't scurry off. They're just little mini dinosaurs, and they hunt other lizards and snakes. And they're just cool animals. They get this blood red kind of, that's where they get that collared lizard name, kind of markings in their, when they're in the mating season. And then of course you've got a horny toad there on the right, you know, very popular. They can shoot blood out of their eyes as a defense mechanism. So just really interesting animals. The horny toad is the state reptile of New Mexico. There you see it depicted in real life and on a petroglyph, right? Very, you know, important kind of spiritual animal as well. You also got everything from deer and elk to, you know, kind of bears, bobcats, you know, mountain lion, cougar, also in this area. So you got everything from your bigger apex Western predators to obviously your kind of your ungulates or your deer and your elk through moving through this area. You used to have pronghorn antelope in this area as well, but obviously those were hunted out and no longer found in the area of the Caja. But, you know, if the area gets protected, maybe there'll be species reintroduction. You know, here you see obviously, you know, baby deer bedded down, a fawn. There's a huge petroglyph of a mountain lion depicted there. You also had wolves and coyotes in the area historically. There you go. You can kind of see those depicted in the petroglyphs as well. This is one of my favorite petroglyphs. I'm also a fly fishing guide. This is probably a cutthroat trout. One of the few fish petroglyphs you'll certainly see in the area, you know, in not only in the area, but really in a lot of the desert Southwest. Kind of speaking to the riparian nature of the area of the Caja del Rio. And this kind of speaks to that, right? So you have this kind of volcanic, harsh desert plateau that can kind of spring to life, but then you also have these bigger riparian flyways and areas that are home to lots of different kinds of birds and fish and amphibians and all kinds of things like that as well. You see these bigger panels of petroglyphs in those riparian areas, and just kind of the density, as you can see right there. Let's talk a little bit about the Spanish history into the area. Obviously, running from the late 1500s, moving up from Mexico City into Okeowinge Pueblo, or San Juan Pueblo is what it was called at the time, right above the capital city of Santa Fe. If you notice that the Camino Real chart is kind of right there. The Camino Real actually was there before the city of Santa Fe. It was formed as a capital, and so originally there was no city of Santa Fe. It kind of bypassed it, and then ultimately kind of picked it up as and different campsites were formed before that. It would take about 6 months to go up from Mexico City to San Juan Pueblo. Is an incredibly hard, difficult trip. You had everything from sheep herders and grazers to soldiers to priests to you name it on those caravans, kind of moving up into northern New Mexico on that Camino Real. It obviously shifted enormously the world, moving from, kind of the bigger form of colonization into that area, bringing lots of different culture, lots of different foods, lots of different goods, but also lots of different complexities, right? And that was, looked like everything from a history of violence with Oñate, to kind of the understanding and, moving into when they, the Pueblo Revolt happened in 1680. And then obviously in 1692, the Spanish came back in on the Camino Real. The road was in huge disrepair and kind of resettled the area, forming different capitals along the way. As you can kind of see in that history, obviously, is 400, plus years old and still lives very much today. And kind of complex intersectionality of those different cultures in the area. The other thing that I would say about the Camino Real that's very significant, especially with regard to the Caja del Rio, is when the Spanish came in as early as the early, 1600s, one of the things they noticed was that the Caja del Rio is what they called the line of demarcation between kind of the Rio Abajo and the Rio Arriba, the upper river and the lower river. Of New Mexico. And they noticed that there were distinct cultures, cuisines, economies, people, between northern and southern New Mexico. And anyone who's been to New Mexico knows that that's still something that's kind of very prided and challenged, in today's world, about who's got the better green chili and red chili, who's got the more authentic cuisines and foods between Las Cruces and Santa Fe and Albuquerque. And so what's interesting is that really as early as the early 1600s, the Spanish were noticing that there was differences. There were differences in everything in terms of the people and the cuisines and the economies. And the Caja del Rio was the line of demarcation between that. So I think it's just so fascinating that that's something that's, 400 plus years old and still lives in modern day New Mexico and still have those conversations and arguments. Here you're moving more into the kind of Euro-American history. And on the left-hand side, you see the formation of New Mexico Highway 1 had 26 hairpin turns. That was formed as a road, and that kind of picked up on the Camino Real and was going up that La Bajada escarpment, and that's that 700-foot rock volcanic face. And the Camino Real, basically, shifted into becoming Highway 1 and then ultimately Route 66, or portions of the Camino Real. When you think about the Camino Real, think about it much more in the sense of a complex highway system where there's road spurs and kind of things that kind of jet off of it. It's not just one linear line like that map made it out to be. There were lots of different routes, depending on the weather, depending on, whether people were being under attack as they were traveling along it, depending on where campsites were and where you could graze versus if, you were traveling with soldiers and families and who was in the caravan and what kind of train they could get over. And so one of the routes, of the Camino Real went up this straight, La Bajada escarpment face. Another route went through the river riparian area, but obviously was subject to flooding and ambush. And another route went all the way past the mountains around the other side. So think about it more in that sense, that it was a very kind of multifaceted, cultural kind of exchange system. And Route 66 ultimately picked up on one of those veins up La Bajada escarpment and kind of became that famed mother road. And there you see some of the signage of Route 66. But what's really interesting is had 26 hairpin turns going up this 700-foot rock face escarpment. The original Model T trucks cars did not have fuel injection. And because it was such a steep face that they had to go up, they had to drive it up backwards to keep the gas in the engine. So they would hire local drivers from the different villages to drive those cars backwards up that hill. You can imagine how perilous that was. These are, of course, like driving on bike tires, with spokes at the time, going backwards up that hill. And they would hire local drivers from the different villages to kind of do that. Obviously, this led to kind of, bigger expansion into the Fred Harvey tours, and a lot of the understanding of kind of the Native American side of the West was all kind of captured here as well. There you see what that road looks like today. So I'll go back so you can kind of see it. This is the area today. You can still see some of that original road right there into it, right? You can actually see some of the wagon swalls kind of down. If down on this right, you'll see kind of by that first power line tower, there's a bunch of cholla cactuses. That's one of the original areas of the Camino Real where the wagon swalls can still be found into the rutted into the earth. And so that's what that area looks like now today in modern day. And you can see some of the original, line of that road. You can see some of the original line of the Camino Real and kind of all that coming together. And of course, that's right directly between Santa Fe and Albuquerque. So if you've ever flown into Albuquerque and driven to Santa Fe, that's that area right between there. Ultimately, President Eisenhower, as part of the federal highway system, moved that road alignment 3 miles over, and that became what is currently I-25. We've done a lot of advocacy with youth. There's myself and my daughter. She's on my pack. She was about maybe 1 at the time. We used to go hiking. This was a great place for families to go, especially during the pandemic when obviously you had young kids, they couldn't be vaccinated, not being indoors. So, a lot of families like myself would go to the Caja and obviously take kids to see these petroglyphs and learn about the culture and the history and the diverse traditions. Right there on the right is Senator Ben Ray Lujan with one of the kids that we took out from the Boys and Girls Club. And so a part of our work as a coalition, part of my work as a faith leader is to really educate people about the importance of this area, what it speaks to in terms of history and culture and tradition and wildlife, but also what it means to future generations and why we need to preserve this area for them to be able to understand these areas and to kind of have that living history book as well. And so we work to take a lot of kids out, especially kids that are disadvantaged, to this area on field trips as a part of kind of getting outdoors. And we look at everything from the petroglyphs to the wildlife to golden eagles and bald eagles nests to hummingbird nests and everything in between. So that's a big part of our work too, is to educate future generations about the stewardship of this amazing creation. One thing I'll also say before we jump to the next slide, this is also where First Presbyterian Church holds its Easter sunrise services. So it's an area that's incredibly sacred and remains an area of prayer and pilgrimage today to not only the Spanish and Pueblo communities, but also to modern day churches. And we have a big bonfire out in the morning and we watch the sunrise come up. And this is an area that, is very, very important to hold as a place of prayer and pilgrimage, and many different communities still use this. It was really interesting. Even, about 6 months ago, I met a Muslim mother who was bringing her son up to the Caja del Rio to pray in one of the caves up there because that's something that's very important to their tradition. And so this area is a very important spiritual and sacred landscape to so many different traditions, many that are since time immemorial, and others that have come in more modern day. But one thing I do know is that it is a place of deep spirituality, deep prayer, and incredible importance that's really worthy of protection. You can see some of the support that we've had. I think one of the biggest things that our coalition has done is we've gotten all the state land protected in the Caja del Rio. So there was about 10,000 acres of surface and subsurface level areas. And this our coalition has gotten the state land commissioner to sign a mining withdrawal, any kind of any other kind of further development in those areas, and to really kind of protect the history and the culture of the Caja del Rio. So that's one of the big things that we accomplished at the end of last year, was getting all the state land protected, over 10,000 acres of that protected. But we obviously have enormous amounts of support from tribal leaders, from local elected officials. We've got support resolutions from counties, and this is all kind of what you do to build up a national monument campaign. To be honest with you, these are kind of the things they look for and the White House looks for, to make sure that there's just broad, diverse support. You also take out a lot of groups to this area. I lead a lot of hikes. I lead a lot of kind of these educational field trips, as you're hearing today. And I also do that with a lot of churches and a lot of the faith community. And so I'll work with, not only the Boys and Girls Club, but also, the UCC church in the area who wants to go out for a hike and take them, or their youth, or, a group of people from, a homeowners association wants to get out, or local businesses, or the reporters. And so I kind of do a lot of that work, throughout the week. And in the nicer weather, as kind of spring warms up, I'll probably be out there a couple times a week doing those different kind of tours. So the bigger threats that you're seeing to this landscape, obviously, there's a huge attack right now going on public lands. There's 640 million acres of public lands in the United States. This is a really amazing and unique concept to this country, where anybody can have an opportunity to, really enjoy America's public lands, or national parks, or BLM lands, or Forest Service lands, and keep those open and accessible to the public. That's really incredible things. A lot of people go to public lands as a place of prayer, a place of deep spirituality, but also go to those places for family fun and recreation. In some communities, especially ones that are in my state, very rural, I mean, the public lands, this is their gym. This is, their pharmacy. A lot of tribes still harvest their medicines from this area, or their sacred plants. And so protecting these areas and making sure that they have the resources needed to protect them is really, really critical. Obviously, you're seeing an administration that is very much in disagreement with that right now. That's threatening to sell off these public lands, threatening to transfer these to kind of the highest bidder, and basically also cutting off access and opportunity on these lands. And this is a huge threat across the country. And this obviously ties into the agency cuts that you're seeing, whether it's national park staff, BLM, Forest Service staff. When agencies don't have the ability to keep these lands safe, or to keep people safe in these lands, or to make sure that there's fire risk are mitigated, it becomes incredibly problematic. And so you're seeing some of these bigger injustices, on public lands all over the country, especially in the American West where I live. And so it's really important, that people understand the ramifications of these agency cuts, and what that means for wildlife, what that means for local communities, what that means for local economies, and ultimately what that may mean for entire cities, and areas that, may be impacted by wildfire, and there's not enough resources or people to manage that in these areas. And so the things are not only devastating to families and economies. We've got multiple families in our church, where people have lost their jobs. We've got a mother of a 3-year-old who lost her job in this kind of situation. And so people are feeling it. Our communities are feeling these cuts, but it's also going to be having devastating impacts as the summer heats up and more people are on these lands. There's more law enforcement issues on these lands, and there's just an overall lack of resources. So just wanted to point that out. Road development, obviously illegal OHV usage, not following travel management's another big issue on the Caja. That obviously carves up the landscape, impacts cultural sites, impacts historic sites, impacts wildlife movement on the area. And with that, of course, comes illegal dumping. And, I'm not talking small illegal dumping. I'm talking, dumping of washing machines and, hot water heaters and couches. And then, with that comes the shooting, right? Why go out there and just dump it when you can also shoot at it? So we've seen everything from TVs and satellite dishes to safes and the washing machine shot at. And of course, that leaks the chemicals into the ground and into the air. And this is just kind of a bigger problem about responsible stewardship of God's creation, right? And that's one of the big things too, as a member of clergy member, that's really important to kind of lift up, that how we use these lands and how we steward these lands needs to be very respectful of all of these traditions and the things and values I'm talking about. As opposed to just, seeing this as kind of a Wild West area where you can do whatever you want. And that's a big challenge, on public lands. And of course, with those resources and agency cuts, those challenges will just get worse. You also see poaching and destruction of endangered species habitat, kind of go hand in hand with all that. What I was just saying, illegal wood cutting, rock removal, petroglyph defacement. Here you see some petroglyphs that were shot at, as kind of used as a target. And so that's some of the problem that we're seeing. You're also seeing some vandalism. These are petroglyphs and sacred sites. This is actually something that I helped with the FBI. There was a vandalism case on kind of a sacred cave. You also see some really hate symbols up there, kind of showing what's happening in the nation, right? And this is disrespect of the federal public lands, and disrespect of sacred ancient sites as well. So there's some of the illegal dumping there on the right that we've kind of picked up off the area. As I can say, it's not just like your day-to-day trash. It's just really Wild West. You have that illegal OHV use. I mean, here you see one of those big Can-Am vehicles driving in the middle of a river area. I mean, that's just nuts, right? Like that's leaking fluids and oil and gas and kind of stuff into the river, but it's also impacting the riparian zone, impacting the bug life, and kind of fish life in those areas. And it's just foolishness, just a whole lot of foolishness. So, working a lot with law enforcement on that issue. But obviously these resource cuts are going to, bring more problems to this area. And, we really need to to continue to, you know, as a faith community, hammer home that responsible stewardship of God's creation, I think is really key, because at some point law enforcement is either not going to have the resources or there's just not going to be enough of them. And at some point we have to really live our deeper ethics and values. So that's kind of it. Happy to answer any questions, talk. Hey, Rebecca, it's good to see you. Haven't seen her in a while. We went to seminary together. Yeah, so it's just really good to connect with you all. Happy to answer any questions, talk about anything you all want to talk about. And happy to answer any
Thanks for
questions.
thanks for that awesome and thorough presentation. We do want to open it up for questions, but I want to ask you just one question to get us started off. One, it's kind of a twofer question. So one, are there ways that Presbyterians and people of faith can come alongside and support these efforts? And then the second part of that question is, do you have any advice for folks who may be looking to get engaged in efforts in their own community, or find ways to build coalition and relationships to do this kind of work in their own community?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in terms of getting involved in the Caja del Rio, we obviously have the, you know, you go to cajadelrio.org is the coalition website. But EarthKeepers, you know, follow EarthKeepers, and you know, I put the link in the chat, that website, get involved in our newsletter. That's a great place. We always, you know, are obviously knee deep in all of this issue. Great place to kind of track what's going on, you know, different local events, different, you know, what's happening. I think we're, you know, as a coalition, we're in a bit of a tricky spot, obviously, with this administration. I mean, the really interesting thing about this coalition is we are built in a very bipartisan way. And that's kind of one of the things that my background, you know, I work with a lot of faith leaders, I work with a lot of veterans, I work with a lot of like traditional land users, cattle permittees. And that was part of the reason we built the coalition the way we did, because we just saw these political winds and these pendulum swings that were going on in our country. And landscapes like this deserve better than that, right? It shouldn't be who's in office, depending on, you know, whether a landscape or a petroglyph that's been around for thousands of years should survive or not. And so, you know, we built our coalition in a very like diverse and bipartisan way. But we're also watching what this administration is doing and how it's treating public lands and who it's appointing, and we're kind of seeing some of those bigger challenges. And so, you know, we're kind of considering, you know, is there an opportunity for this administration to do something like a national monument? Maybe. I don't rule out anything, and you know, through God, all things are possible, but it's also difficult. And we're not going to fool ourselves either. And so we're kind of in this position of how do we protect the landscape in whatever way, shape, or form we can, whether that's at the local, the state, the federal level. And at the same time, kind of be as innocent as doves and as wise as serpents with how we do all this. And that's a complex reality. And so you've got to be really skilled and kind of nimble and adaptive in that way, and resilient. And that's where our coalition is working. But yeah, we would love to have your help. I mean, obviously PCUSA News has been great about covering this issue. Super grateful for that. A lot of the Oak Flat work I've done is kind of, you guys can Google that as well. That's really important stuff to stand in line with those tribes, especially right now. I think those are big challenges in Arizona. So, you know, we can certainly talk more about Oak Flat in the future as well. Those are really important issues. But I think, you know, understanding and helping people realize that, you know, the Caja del Rio is a very important sacred landscape. It's a church in many ways to lots of different people, right? And you know, if we were going to run and desecrate a church and run power lines through it and roads through it, and people would be up in arms. But this is what we're doing on these landscapes, and we have to kind of start to see that it's important for all of us as spiritual, you know, followers to stand in solidarity with one another, and to kind of work with each other. And so a lot of these sacred landscapes for a lot of tribal communities are in jeopardy, whether it's Grand Canyon, whether it's, you know, Oak Flat in Arizona, or whether it's Bears Ears in Utah, you kind of name it. And so, you know, Caja in New Mexico, it's these areas are continuing to be under huge threat, right? And sometimes the threat is internal and sometimes the threat is external. But I think there's a great way for the faith communities to kind of step alongside with folks. I'm always happy to and willing to do that. And to your second part of the question, I would just say listening is really key, right? You know, instead of coming in and, you know, I always, as a pastor, I always say, but before people care about what you need, you know, they need to know that you care. And so before you kind of come in and tell everybody about what's what on the ground and what's happening, I think it's really important to listen, to build trust, to work on authentic relationships, and to also allow the dignity of difference. Right. I mean, that's one of the big things that's about our coalition is I'm not going to try to smooth things over. There's hard histories. There's a lot of complexities. Let's own those truths. Let's work through that kind of reality, and let's not sugarcoat things. Let's be honest. Let's be vulnerable. Let's build trust and listen. And let's do that in a respectful way. And that's kind of my job, is to try to hold that atmosphere. It's not always easy. It's sometimes really hard. But I think that's the real spiritual, deeper work that we can all do. And I think the role of faith leaders is very, very important nowadays in this kind of work. And I think the environmental movement needs to see that and to own that. That's not always the case. Sometimes they see faith communities more part of the problem than the solution, but I think they need to know that there's good allies there. And I also think we need to make our voices heard, right? That we're not just in pulpits and pews and ignoring what's happening in the outside world. I think it's very important that we have a duty right there from the beginning in the book of Genesis to be sacred, earth keepers, right? I mean, that's to kind of keep the earth. You see that command. And I do a whole other presentation on the reinterpretation of those original biblical texts. But I think it's very important to kind of like look at that and re-examine that and remind the world that we are the original stewards of this, and God has given us that sacred duty. And so, no matter whatever political system's in place, we need to stand firm in that. And because we have a deeper calling. And that's very important. And it's not just something that we kind of do because we think the environment's interesting or important. It's something that's a duty to who we are as God's children.
Thank you. Barry, do you want to ask your question?
Andrew, thank you for that presentation. New Mexico, Mary and I, New Mexico is one of our favorite places. If we hadn't had a son here in the Bay Area, we might have retired there. We've been to Bandelier, we've been to Cochiti, some other pueblos. We're not exactly off-road types, so the main thing I wanted to tell you is that most of what you presented today was new to us, which I really appreciated. I was concerned about the last item on your list of challenges, the mining and potential mining on BLM land. I wondered if you'd say a little bit more about that, but also one of the things I've been worrying about with no real basis for it, but that doesn't keep you from worrying, is that this administration might try to make some offers that Pueblos and tribes can't refuse for mineral extraction on Pueblos and reservations. Is there anything like that that I should be legitimately worrying about?
Yeah, I mean, and as to mining more broadly, yeah, I think that's a very huge concern. I mean, obviously, with the kind of what was the Secretary of the Interior's recent orders around kind of looking into protected landscapes and the ability to do oil and gas and energy development and mining on those, and kind of expediting that and trying to bypass certain environmental laws and public processes, I think is very concerning. And lots of red flags should be going up at that. I think mining can be everything from your kind of precious minerals and your coppers and your nuclear elements to obviously hard rock mining, which is very just rudimentary and rough, right? And so I think, there's huge threats of that, I think, all over the place. I think Caja being one of those. There's 2 potential leases on Caja, 1 active mining lease, and then there's hard rock mining potential all over pretty much anywhere, right? Gravel and those kind of things. And so I think those are huge issues. I think making sure that we hold the administration accountable to public processes, to open, public comments, to talking to your delegation. I mean, one of the nice things about EarthKeepers and our work is, we need your help in California. We need your help in Louisville, Kentucky. We need you talking to your representatives everywhere. I mean, I want folks hearing about these different issues that we put out on our action alerts, and I want people of faith speaking up. And I want, a senator all of a sudden to hear, like, why are you talking about this mine in New Mexico if I'm in California? Because that's why you're a U.S. senator. You should care about the entire United States, right? So I think we need to continue to make sure that we have our voices be heard. And, obviously they're going to be representing the state of California, but at the same time, I think it's important that they recognize that they need to care about these issues. And I think one of the big breakdowns that you see in DC, especially with regard to conservation, is the fact that people just think they represent their own state. Right. And this is a big challenge with public lands that, why would I care about public lands in New Mexico if I live in Idaho? Why would I care about what's happening at, the Caja del Rio if I live in Oregon? Well, because these are America's public lands. You're all stewards of these lands. You all own these lands in trust. These are ancestral, important lands to many tribes that need to be taken care of, and there needs to be opportunities for co-stewardship and co-management. And that's the big challenge I see with happening in conservation issues and trying to get landscapes like Caja del Rio. I mean, the reason the national monuments are under attack is because Congress has failed. Usually the president uses a national monument because Congress will not pass a law to protect a certain area. And so why would some senator in Vermont or Virginia protect an area in New Mexico? They're going to say, well, that's not relevant to my constituents, because we don't have that sense of stewardship. We don't have that bigger vision where we need to care about all these areas. And so what's happening in Alaska or Oregon or Virginia or in New York or Wisconsin is important to New Mexicans and important to Californians. And I think we need to get back to that sense of the interconnectedness of us, that bigger web of life. And we need to hold our politicians accountable to that same thing, right? Because that's the big challenge I see in conservation on a federal level, is that, we tried to get the Rio Grande del Norte National Monument in New Mexico, which is really around the Taos area. When I worked for Senator Bingaman, through 3 separate Congresses. 242,000 acre, amazing area, well deserving of protection. Could never get that through Congress, because why would some senator in Kansas vote for that? Because it's in New Mexico. That's the problem. And that's why you end up with having national monuments, is because the president under the Antiquities Act can sign those and protect those, because I think they realize this problem is starting to occur. So the national monuments are not an issue. It's actually a fundamental breakdown, in my opinion, of Congress being able to protect landscapes across the board. And so challenging politicians on those kind of things is very important as well.
Thanks.
Sure. But come out to New Mexico and see us. I'll take you hiking on the Caja for sure. Get you all both out there. Love to take you.
We can avoid that beautiful rattlesnake you showed. That's my only request.
You got it. I will avoid it. I have one of the biggest ones I ever saw that was like, 6 feet long, was on the Caja. It was pretty surreal. I was hiking with a U.S. Senator in the Boys and Girls Club, and we saw it. And we'd gotten all the way through the hike, didn't sprain any ankles, no skin knees, took all these 13, 10-year-old kids with a senator, no problems. And then we got back to about 10 feet of the parking lot, and that snake crawled out right in front of my truck. I could not believe it. So, but it was, harmless and didn't do anything and just slid her on.
Let's see, and we're right about time, so I don't want to keep anybody too long. Valerie
I have a
has.
very quick question. Thank you so much for this presentation. Is this work going to be affected, or is being affected by all the administration cuts? I know you mentioned that towards the end, and I know that affected a lot of public parks. I'm just curious to find out about this specific one.
So about the Caja specifically?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yep. So, yes, absolutely. So the field offices and the regional offices of both the Forest Service and BLM have lost staff that are overseeing this area. Significant staff losses in the Santa Fe National Forest. I wanted to say, I think the last numbers I heard were around 60 people. Obviously that's really critical to fire. That's really critical to road management, biodiversity management, species management, wild and scenic river management, all of it. So, yeah, these cuts are being felt. And I think it's really important that people see that these are not just some amorphous, faceless, cut, that this is real people. These are people that are, federal workers are our neighbors. They are beloved children of God. I mean, that they are our members of our congregations, for Pete's sake. And so this isn't some faceless, amorphous kind of thing, that this is impacting real families, real congregations, real people, and it's impacting real landscapes, and people are hurting. And, it's done in a very cruel and callous way, and it's leaving a lot of disrepair in the wake of it. And I think it's going to have huge challenges in terms of, how our country is going to move forward, how our public lands can move forward. And, we're going to really have to band together and be strong, and we're going to have to be prophetic in our voice, right? I always say, this is the time for the church to be the church. This is the time for us to stand in our values. And we need to own who we are, and we also need to be unashamed of that, and we need to stand deeply and firmly in who Jesus is, and in the teachings and the way he treated people and the way and what he called us to do. And it is time for us Presbyterians to really own that, to stand in that, to value that, and to also, be a challenge to other forms of Christianity that maybe aren't owning that, or maybe distorting that. And I think we have to do that in a really good and positive way.
Reverend Black, I don't know if you have time for one last question, because we've got,
Of course.
okay, just
Happy to
this
have
one last question, then we'll wrap up. Brian? Are you there, Brian? You're muted. Well,
Yep.
maybe not. So, thanks everybody for joining. Oh, Brian's unmuted now.
Maybe not.
Maybe not. So everybody, thanks, and thanks so much, Reverend Andrew Black, for joining us today. We really appreciate it. It's been super informative, inspirational. We're gonna send, as usual, we'll send a follow-up email. So if you have any resources that you want to email to me that I can share with folks, I will share some of the links to organizations already and efforts already mentioned here, but anything else that you might have to share. Just an announcement, we do have our Centering Partners Voices Gathering is coming up next Tuesday, where we will be hearing from a number of partners from all over the world. They're going to discuss some advice for all of us for living in uncertain times. We're calling this, let me find my thing. So,
when democracy is in
yeah, when democracy is in peril. So join us for a conversation with global grassroots leaders on staying sane, planning, and continuing the fight for democracy and human rights in challenging times. So I'll send that in my follow-up email, but I'm gonna also just pop that link to our little Canva advertisement for that, for anyone who might want to join us for that conversation next Tuesday, same time, 12 p.m. Eastern time, from 12 to 1:30. So thanks, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
I was able to unmute real quick, maybe.
Oh,
Thanks again, guys.
Thanks.
I think we're
Yeah,
going. Brian, you can email me, maybe if you want to email your question.
Brian, if you want to ask me, I'm
Or-
here. Fine.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Sure.
All right. I want to say thank you again because I heard your suggestion about the Peace and Reconciliation Committee in South Africa. That gave you a good foundation, I think, for what's going on here. But I was wondering if there's any action that we could take to divest from certain companies or some of those resources that are going financially in that direction, and maybe divert our funds to another way.
Yeah. I think that's going to be a huge and effective tool, in my opinion. Obviously money speaks in this country, in this administration. And I think, you're seeing economic boycott, divestment, I think are going to be really important tools. I mean, I do think there's some throwback to the 60s civil rights movement and bus boycotts and things like that, have to take place. And I think, who better to talk about those sacrifices than the churches? And there's a reason that folks like Martin Luther King and a lot of the other leaders that were faith leaders, that led some of that work. I think that's going to be very important, honestly. And you're dealing with multifaceted, complex, interconnected corporate entities right now, that are big. I mean, we're dealing with national laboratories, for example, that have 13 corporations behind a U.S. Nuclear laboratory. So you're not just dealing with, small kind of, individual corporations. You're dealing with conglomerates that are incredibly powerful and have enormous force and want their way, and that's what you're up against. And so I think, finding ways to band together to kind of create unified approaches on this is going to be a big issue. But I think it's a very important issue. I know it's a touchy issue. I was at the helm of constitutional services when a lot of the Israel-Palestine stuff was going on, Caterpillar divestment, those kind of things. I understand the multifaceted, complex tensions within the church, within society around those issues. But I do think that is a important and effective strategy. Obviously, that was a big, important, and effective strategy around apartheid in South Africa. That was something that was very scary to apartheid leaders, and Desmond Tutu obviously knew that, and so did Nelson Mandela. And that was a part of the change in South Africa was around those kind of things. So I do think it's an important tool. I think it's a tool that has to be used in the correct way. And one of the things I've always kind of talked to folks about is, with what we're seeing nowadays, that there needs to be nuance. One of the big concerns I had about kind of the boycott the other day was like, it was going to also impact small businesses that might be responsible and on the right side of the equation. And so if you're just doing a full out economic boycott, maybe you're not supporting them and, local businesses. And I work with a lot of like veterans, for example, that have disabilities, and I'm, take them fly fishing. And so that day we actually went to a local fly shop that does amazing conservation work, and we bought all our stuff from there. But I think that kind of nuanced messaging and stuff needs to be there, because you don't want to have unintended consequences. And those smaller ones will obviously be the first to go and are less resilient than the big ones. And so we got to be smart, and we got to be tactical, and we got to know what we're doing on those kind of things. So that's just my 2 cents. I'm not an expert in that anyway, and I know other folks at the national offices are. So, but I support good work to be done wherever it can be done.
I'm not sure that any of us are experts on anything, but I think we're all just trying our best.
That's
So
right.
thank you so much.
You got it. All right. Take care.
Y'all have a
You,
great day.
You
Bye.
too.
very much.